Unit 2, Lesson 4, Urbanization. Unit 2, Lesson 4, Vocabulary. Remembering all the changes that took place after the Civil War and the Reconstruction in the South, the westward expansion during America's Manifest Destiny period, the Mexican-American War and all of the land gained from Mexico, and the Native Americans who were removed from their land following bloody battles in the U.S. Indian Wars. Subsequently, they were moved to reservations throughout the United States. The rapid rise of industrialization, which caused growth of cities, aided by the new inventions of the time, like the light bulb, the telephone, and the Bessemer process, which was aided even more by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. And we've studied the differences between robber barons and captains of industry. Both terms meant they were industrialists, big business owners, and titans of industry, where one, robber barons, did so for personal gain and profit and sought to exploit workers, and one, captains of industry, sought to help their community and help their country by offering competitive wages and benefits for their workers. Recapping our immigration lessons up to this point, that a large number of immigrants either came through Ellis Island in New York, mostly from Europe, or they came through Angel Island in San Francisco, mostly from Asia. Around 20 million Europeans arrived in America between 1870 and 1920, and just over 200,000 Chinese arrived in America between 1870 and 1920. Many of those reasons, the push factors for those immigrants to leave their country was poverty and a lack of opportunities in their homeland. And the pull factors for wanting to come to the United States were financial and social opportunities as well as freedom. This growth of an urban population, aided by the inventions and technological advances, allowed cities to grow exponentially. Large urban factories and densely populated skyscrapers. And the immigration aided in that most immigrants moved to these cities and lived in extremely crowded buildings, with the immigrant population rising from 10 million to 54 million between 1870 and 1920. The exponential growth in population and industry led directly to urbanization. An example of urbanization would be that a store like Walmart is interested in opening a new store in a metropolitan city. They're promising over 400 jobs will be created if they open their Walmart store. This lures in or brings in other major retailers, fast food industries, coffee shops like Dutch Bros or Starbucks, and other smaller stores like an Office Depot or maybe even a 24-hour fitness, an Old Navy, that want to come and set up near the main store or the anchor store, Walmart. This promises even more jobs from these additional retailers. And with the promise of jobs, home construction increases. It's called speculative or spec building, where now home builders want to build homes that would house all of the new workers for these new stores. So the increase in available housing plus newly available jobs equals a population boom, and that's urbanization. So why did immigrants often settle in cities? Cities were usually the cheapest places to live, in tenement buildings, which were kind of like modern apartment buildings. It was closest to where they arrived in the United States, so if they were coming from Europe and arrived through Ellis Island, they typically stayed in New York and the surrounding boroughs. And if they were coming from Asia across the Pacific and they came through Angel Island, they typically stayed in the San Francisco or Oakland Bay Area. These factories that were nearby offered many jobs to unskilled laborers, especially recent immigrants. Though they paid lower wages, it was beneficial for both the factory or company owner and the immigrants. This is an example of a tenement, a typical Glasgow tenement during the 1890 to 1910 period in New York. You can see that this isn't exactly big, and though there are kitchens in each of these apartments, individual apartments, there is not an individual bathroom, as we talked about last week during our immigration section. One bathroom would be shared per floor for all of the tenants. This is an example of a tenement room with a young child hunched over in the center of the picture. This is an example of a tenement restroom or toilet in a tenement building. So just how many immigrants were in the United States at this time? By 1890, there were twice as many Irish in New York as there were in Dublin, Ireland. And by 1910, immigrant families made up more than half of the population in 18 major American cities. The migration movement from rural areas within America coincided with the Great Migration of African Americans after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era in the South. That many moved from rural areas because technology reduced the number of laborers needed on rural farms. The inventions of the Industrial Revolution meant that fewer people could do more work than previously had been done. They were escaping racial violence in the South after the Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws, and they were escaping political oppression in rural areas. But mainly, individuals migrated from rural areas to urban city areas to seek better jobs with more stable pay and better benefits and conditions. Even though most immigrants lived in cities in extremely crowded housing, like the picture showing you in a tenement house where 7 beds were found in one room, many still found this a preferred living arrangement to the oppression they faced in their home countries or in the Deep South. Well, the immigration, though, led to an Americanization movement spurred on by the nativists' feelings and resentment of recently arrived immigrants. To the Americanization movement could be defined as a social movement by government and citizen groups to teach immigrants skills needed for citizenship, skills such as English literacy, history, government, cooking, and proper etiquette. So what was the immigrant response to Americanization? That many did not want to abandon their traditions, and ethnic communities developed within large cities. We have Little Manila here in Stockton, California, representing the Philippines, and Olvera Street in Los Angeles, California, representing a little slice of Mexico. Chinatown in New York, New York, or throughout the country, representing China. And even Little Italy in San Francisco, which represents Italy. This enabled immigrants to speak their own language and customs and retain their cultural roots. But, as with most cities during the Industrial Revolution, these urban enclaves, these urban and ethnic communities quickly got overcrowded. Photos and a map location of Little Manila in Stockton, California. Photos of Olvera Street in Los Angeles, California, just 2 blocks south of LA's Chinatown and about a half mile from Dodger Stadium. Photos from the various Chinatowns throughout North America. Some of the bigger Chinatowns in the world can be found in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Vancouver, and Los Angeles. And lastly, a photo from Little Italy in San Diego, California. There are various Little Italy ethnic neighborhoods and enclaves in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Philadelphia, to name a few. One of the responses to the urbanization during the Industrial Revolution, one of the reform movements, was the social gospel movement, where it was preached that salvation through service to the poor was our best source of reform. One of the prominent figures of the social gospel movement, Jane Addams, founded the Hull House in Chicago, Illinois. The Hull House and other settlement houses were community centers meant to provide assistance to the poor. They were run mainly by middle-class, educated women who taught courses as remedial as public hygiene and safety, and they provided medical care to all who would seek it out. A couple of key terms from our vocabulary that will help us understand urbanization and capitalism, as well as a labor reform movement, are yellow journalism versus muckrakers. Both terms represent reporters during the Industrial Revolution. But whereas yellow journalists were sensational reporters who exaggerated stories or made up stories completely, even invented characters to support their fiction. And muckrakers were fact-based reporters who documented unfair conditions and treatment of workers. And their articles and photos were used internationally, and they were highly respected for their work. Jacob Riis is a prominent example of a muckraker. He was an immigrant from Denmark who became a police reporter and often worked in the slums of these industrialized cities. He was also a photographer who documented the lives of the poor living in tenement buildings. His most famous work, How the Other Half Lives, is shown and chronicled on the next few slides. Photo from Jacob Riis of a tenement building in New York. Another photo from Jacob Riis and How the Other Half Lives, taken outside Philadelphia. And a photo of a tenement schoolhouse with 35 children of mixed ethnicities, immigrants and native-born alike, learning with their teacher in a room no bigger than a modern closet. Photo of an internal courtyard of a tenement building, New York, New York. Upton Sinclair, American author, novelist, wrote The Jungle in 1906. It chronicled the harsh conditions and exploited workers common during the Industrial Revolution. And this helped begin the reform movement during the Industrial Revolution. Upton Sinclair, a prominent example of a muckraker. Harsh conditions and child labor, a phenomenon common during the Industrial Revolution, brought to light by Upton Sinclair and other muckrakers of the time. Examples of urbanization: Manhattan Island, New York, then versus now. Dubai of the United Arab Emirates in 1990 versus Dubai of the United Arab Emirates today. Shanghai, 1990 versus Shanghai today in 2022. And lastly, a look at Houston, Texas in the 1920s, compared against a view of Houston, Texas today, a modern, industrialized, Americanized city.